My name is Dr. Josephine Palermo, and my superpower is creating business cultures that transform organizations team by team. In this episode, I speak to Greg Nutter, best-selling author of the book B2C Selling and an expert on the selling process and how to influence the decision-making processes of others. We talk about the art of selling and creating great sales teams in organizations. Even if you aren't in sales, you'll find this conversation insightful in terms of how to influence others within your organization. So whether it be selling or influencing or both, I'm sure you're going to love this conversation as much as I did. Well, hello. It's lovely to have you on the podcast, Greg. Welcome. I'm here with Greg Nutter, who is the author of B2C Selling and a B2B sales expert, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I've just read Greg's book and it's wonderful, so we're going to have an incredible conversation about what is selling, how we do it, and how do you bring that to life in everyday life, particularly if you're in selling, if you're growing a sales team, you might be a consultant, and even if you have an internal role where a lot of the role is influencing others. And I believe that there's a lot of parallels between that and selling. So, Greg, welcome. I'm keen to hear from you in terms of what has brought you to today.
Well, it's been a long journey. So, actually, when I went to school, my degree was in computer science, and I decided I liked talking about it more than actually doing it. So I ended up in sales. And I've been a lifelong learner in sales. I started a sales rep, sales trainer, sales manager, sales leader. And then about 15 years ago, I went into consulting. I worked with some very small companies between, 0 and 20 sales reps, but I also worked with some very large companies like Hewlett Packard and Microsoft and SAP, some very big organizations. So what I found over the last few years in my consulting, I've been working with a number of companies, often in a fractional VP of sales role, and I found a lot of their sellers just either lacked the skills because no one told them, or they'd forgotten the basic skills. And I decided I was going to sit down and write a book so that the next time I had a team, I would say, read this book and then let's work together to figure out how do we implement it. So that's where I am today.
Great, Greg. And I know you do a lot of coaching and consulting and training as well, because as we know, people love books. But what I find is that many people don't read or don't have time to read anymore, which is very sad. But that's okay. That's what the audiobooks are for, and that's what having you in real life here is for. So that's wonderful. In your book, you quote Deming, and I love Deming. My first career was in quality assurance and quality management, and so Deming is a real favorite of mine. And you quote, "If you can't describe what you're doing as a process, you don't know what you're doing." Tell me about that quote. Why was that in your book? And, tell me about your process in particular.
Well, a lot of sellers believe that selling is an art form. It's being fun, telling a joke, talking about your product. It's more relationship building. In fact, you probably heard the line, people buy from people, which is to imply that relationship is the most important thing.
Yes.
And it is in a B2C sales, business to consumer. Surprisingly, being a nice, fun person is nearly not as effective in B2B. Business to business selling is really very process oriented. That doesn't mean that you don't have to be nice and personable, occasionally tell a joke. You don't have to be, stiff, but winning deals, you can win a lot more deals if you follow a consistent process. And I detailed, I think, 4 of the most important processes in the playbook in my book. And I also talk about a consultative selling process, which is different than a business to consumer process.
Yes, and perhaps could we talk about both of those things? Because I think that there might be people who are interested in both, and I'd be interested in really exploring both. But let's start with Let's start with the B2B environment. Perhaps, if you want to just maybe give me the brief description of the
Sure.
process for people that haven't read the book, and then what is it that makes that particularly work in the B2B environment?
Great. Quick question. So I like to use the two axes. One is product complexity, and the other is buying process complexity, right? And so if the product is very simple, I know what it is, you know, a can of beans, for example, and the decision process is really simple. I put it in my grocery cart and walk out. Then the way you sell in that environment uses what we call a two-step. You give information and then you ask for the order. Can I ring that up for you? Would you like some bread to go with that? Right? Very simple. And people use that kind of selling all the time. We see it every time when we go to the store, when we buy, groceries or whatever. And because we see it all the time, we think it works in business to business, but it does not. Because if you go back to those two quadrants, product complexity is much higher, particularly if you're selling a service, such as yourself, Josephine, or some of your listeners. Services are quite complex.
Yes.
There's a lot of nuance between the differences. And when you're selling to businesses, the buying decision process is complex.
Yes.
There's multiple steps. There's a lot of people involved. There's gatekeepers like purchasing and IT and all kinds of people that weigh in. And so what you're trying to do in a B2B environment is to create awareness, right? Selling is about creating awareness. And you don't do that by talking about your product. You actually do that by asking good questions for someone to say, it's an interesting thought, Josephine. I hadn't really considered that. Tell me more. All right?
Yes.
So when it comes to B2B selling, you're trying to create greater awareness and therefore people to change their perspectives around which product, solution, recommendation is better, change their situation, take action to buy a product or change their behaviors.
Yes.
And if you look in leadership really requires influence. I like to say management is about more efficiently or effectively operating within a given paradigm, while leadership is about influencing people to move to a new paradigm.
Yes, yeah. Yes, I love that too. That's very insightful. And so Greg, I think what you're saying is that you have to go into a process by which people develop some insight. So it's a new thought or a new way of thinking about an old problem, perhaps. Is that what you mean? Just want to make sure that I've got that. Tell me a little bit more so we can, because I think that's an interesting aspect.
Yeah, B2B sellers engage in, we talked about B2C sellers. You give information, they ask for the order, right? Or ask for the next logical step. In B2B selling, there's three kinds of key behaviors. One is understanding. So understanding somebody's perspectives around a problem or an opportunity, their perspectives around a solution, their perspectives around whether they should take action. And if they all say, yeah, big problem, we love your solution, we want to buy now, then there's no influence involved, right?
Yes.
But that doesn't happen very often.
Yes.
So if somebody says, well, we're not sure that we need to fix this problem, we're not sure it's really large enough, then the second behavior after understanding is is influencing.
Yes.
So you want to ask good questions for someone to say, Josephine, maybe that's a bigger problem than we thought. Maybe we need to take action. Maybe we need to get our boss involved in this, right? So you influence people to have a different perspective, either on the problem or a solution or the importance of taking action. And then lastly, it's messaging. So if someone told you, you understand their situation, you've influenced where you can. And then when you come out with a proposal or a presentation, you message back based on your understanding and what you've been able to influence.
So you're creating meaning together in that respect when you message that back, right? You're you're in the same zone as the
Yes.
person you're trying to influence and sell. It's very important.
Yeah.
And that's where, that builds empathy, a rapport, trust as well when you do that. So I can see how powerful that is. I can see that this process is really important and thinking about this process. So for example, I just had a potential client the other day. We had a meeting which I thought went really well, where we talked about the potential of the service. We talked about where we thought the problem was, and there was some agreement around the problem. However, the follow-up was a response around, well, I don't think the problem is big enough right now. It's
Yep.
not broken, because really what we were talking about was going from, good to great in a way. Because what we do around the services we provide is you can go from good to great. It's a good idea not to wait until it is broken. But, the response was, well, maybe it's not to your point, not a big enough problem now, or the sense of urgency isn't there quite there now. And so I guess what you're saying, the follow up, what would the follow up be in kind of lay terms? What would you do in that situation?
Well, you hit on a great point that a lot of sellers miss, in that, you know, until someone says we need to fix this, companies have lots of problems that they
Yeah.
do not fix.
Yes.
People have lots of problems and opportunities that you don't try to capture.
Yeah.
So if someone says, Josephine, I hear you, but I don't think that's a big deal right now. So there's two things you can do. So in the consultative model I described, there's something called the ask, suggest, recap model. And what you do, you first ask, well, what's your feeling about how it's going to impact your company if you don't do that, or you personally if you don't do that? And they might say, nothing. I
Yeah.
think it's fine. So the next step is you suggest. You suggest a potential impact that you've seen elsewhere. You might say,
Yes.
well, Josephine, I fully understand that, but I was working with a client the other week and they had a very similar problem. And they got blindsided
Mm,
by a new manager who came on the scene, thought this was unacceptable,
mm,
and and I don't know, fired him, put him on warning, whatever. And you don't really want to make this stuff up, but
yeah.
you want
Yeah.
to suggest that this problem could be actually more severe than they thought.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, if they said, nah, that'll never happen here, then you could suggest something else that you've seen real life,
Mm, mm, mm.
right? So you're trying to create awareness in areas that someone may not have thought about,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. So I love that. I
Uh,
love that, creating awareness.
yeah, and what you're looking to do is, just why on the cover of my book there's a light bulb. It's like for people to go, oh wow,
Yes.
I hadn't thought of that. That's really smart, right? I hadn't thought of that. Now you
Yeah.
can't do that in all cases, but that's B2B selling.
Yes.
Not talking about your product. It's
Yes.
creating awareness so light bulb goes on.
Yes, exactly. And I think that follow up that you've just described is really where you get that light bulb. You do get those light bulb moments, and it's a good thing to think about, because I think normally, so for example, I myself, I may have stopped at, well, it's not quite a problem for you today. Come back. We'll have another chat when maybe it becomes a problem, which is not a
Right,
great, it's not a good situation for the client or me, but particularly for the client, because particularly I really care about the work that I do, and I want more people to be doing things to mitigate harm rather than wait until there's dysfunction and harm. So particularly in the work that I do, so I can see that I can be very driven by that, because for me too, sales has to come from my sense of who I am as well. So,
mm-hmm.
and I know that you kind of understand that too, and because that's where the relationship aspect comes into play. So,
Yeah.
is there anything else, Greg, in the B2B space? Perhaps some things that you've seen people do not so well, or could do better in that part of the process for you, in that messaging part?
Um, the I could go through the five top mistakes that sellers make. But the biggest one is you spend too much time talking about your product.
Yeah.
And I like to say, or solution or offering or services. without the context of a problem
Yes.
that someone says they want to fix or an opportunity they want to capture, any discussion around a solution makes no sense, right?
Yeah.
How much is that? Who cares, right?
Yes.
How long will
Yes.
it take? Who cares, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So it first establishing, finding a problem or an opportunity that somebody says, yeah, I think that's important enough to fix,
Yeah.
right? Um, is is really key. And by the way, on the suggestion part, it's always a suggestion, not a tell. Too many sellers tell, right?
Yes.
They say, well, you need to fix that because,
Yes. Yes.
right? And then it's not collaborative anymore.
Mm,
What you do
mm,
is you suggest something you've seen or heard,
mm, mm.
and then you ask,
Yeah.
would that might that be important to you? So
That's
now
right.
it's a collaborative discussion
Yeah.
around it rather than me telling you what you should think.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And Greg, so once you have that, maybe you do have that light bulb moment. Perhaps if you could explore with me, what's the rest of the process? So you've got your messaging,
Okay.
you've achieved your light bulb moment. What happens after that?
Okay.
Mm.
So companies and people, we'll focus on people for a moment, go through very defined stages when they make not just a buying decision, but almost any decision of consequence, any decision that has some risk to it or complexity to it. And
Yeah.
that's B2B buying processes. So the first stage, which we just talked about, is called the need recognition stage, where someone goes, you know what? I really need to fix that,
Yeah.
right? The next stage they go through is they go through this information search. They ask themselves, um, what's available out there?
Yeah.
What could I do? What are my options, right? And they'll look on the internet, they'll talk to their friends. And once they feel like they have enough options, they go to the next stage with, well, how do I
Yes.
do trade-offs?
Yes.
We call that evaluation of alternatives.
Mm-hmm.
Is it price? Is it I like the person that's selling them? And that sometimes plays a little bit of a
Yeah.
factor. So they look at how do I make the trade-offs? And then they go to the last stage where they say, okay, I'm going to pick this one, and they finalize all the steps. In fact, you could put it into, deep psychological terminology. The first stage is called cognition, understanding your current state. The next stage where people look for information is called divergent thinking.
Mm.
They look around and say, what's available?
Yeah.
Then they go to convergent thinking.
Mm-mm.
How do I make a decision? And the last is called resolution, where they make that final decision.
Mm.
So to your point or your question, is that sellers sometimes just, I got a problem, and then they propose,
Yes.
right? But what they should be doing is saying, okay, this person is going to go through those 4 stages with me or without me. So, okay, you agreed, Josephine, you're going to solve that problem. What kind of information do you need to help make you really comfortable that you're going to make the best decision,
Love it.
the right one? And then you're going to help them get that information. And then you're going to ask, now how are you going to make a trade-off?
Yeah.
Right? Now I could give you some ideas of how other people have done it, and you help them come up with decision criteria.
Mm-mm.
And then the last stage, and this is really important with an organization, is that purchase decision stage is where you're actually going to put together almost like a project plan.
Yeah.
Okay, what do you need to do? What do I need to do? And you guide them through those 4 stages rather than throwing a proposal over the transom and waiting for them to, work themselves through it.
Mm-mm. And I really like that because there's a lot of value add in holding the potential client's hand around that, particularly in complex purchasing environments. Because, I've come up against particularly large organizations. I've come up against the problem where perhaps you have someone who would like to buy from you, but their purchasing environment is so complex and takes time that they don't have the capacity to go through that process right now. I've often heard, I just don't have capacity to go through the procurement process right now. And so that's the barrier. The barrier is, we want you, but,
Right.
the
Too difficult.
bureaucracy is, so helping, what you're saying is help them navigate that bureaucracy, add that value for them, which would be, a real value add for them, because often, people we are talking to are very time poor. That's why they want our help. They want us to
Yeah.
come in and help them with something. Yeah.
Yeah. There's been a number of research reports um, published recently that talk about, a seller or a consultant or an advisor. They all think,
Mm.
oh, the buying process is much more, sorry, the selling process is much more complex these days. Well, what you just said is dead on, is that the buying process is much more complex. People are
Yeah.
swimming in data, information overload.
Yes.
There's more steps and criteria. Companies are, a lot of companies are very risk adverse today.
Yes.
You can lose your job from
Absolutely.
making a bad decision.
Mm.
So one of the things I tell sellers or advisors is exactly what you just said there, is that, if you ask someone, what's your role when it comes to supporting a customer in a buying decision?
Yeah.
And sellers will tell me one of two things, or even consultants. They'll say, my job is to be the expert on my solution, or I'm the relationship manager to make sure that our companies work together. And my opinion is those are good roles, but they're secondary.
Mm.
The primary role should be, you're an expert on the buying decision process, not the selling, the buying decision process, and you're there to help that buyer navigate it, right? And to take as much complexity out of it as you can.
That's right. So is that about getting to know, so understanding the process, but also getting to know those aspects of the organization that are involved, other aspects that are involved in that? So I'm thinking of, for example, going to someone and say, I've already spoken to, or I've already had a look at your buying policy, or I've already spoken to that department. There's already, so that you start to create the pathway for that buying to be smoother, or a
Yeah,
smoother pathway.
yeah, yeah. It's we talk about, and I mentioned it briefly. There's actually two buying decision processes you have to sell to. The first one is an individual. An individual goes through those four stages that I
Yes.
described. Every
Yeah.
individual who weighs in on that buying decision. Some go through really fast. Some take months and years. But there's also a corporate buying decision process,
Yes.
and in there is the gatekeepers, the subject matter expert, the one that'll say, we don't sign an agreement with those terms in there, right? Or an IT department that says, if you don't have a couple references based on our technology, we're not taking you. So
Yeah.
you need to sell to that group too, right?
That's right.
So it's influencing that corporate criteria.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so while the process is roughly structured around those four areas, you need to figure out who's in each stage, which criteria are they really focused on? How do you comply? And what do you do if you can't comply? If somebody
Yeah.
says, we're going to go for the cheapest solution and you don't happen to be, right? So what do you
Yeah.
do? Cross your fingers, lower your price, or are there other things you can do?
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. And then you can maybe break things up a little bit, or offer an entry level
Could
solution or
be,
something like that. Or
could be.
what would,
But
yeah.
but what I find is that when you're in that stage, and it happens in the evaluate alternative stage where you're actually crafting the final solution, that should be very collaborative.
Yeah.
Instead of, well, I'll go away and put something together and what do you think?
Mm.
It's okay, so you mentioned price is really important. How do you think we could get the best solution while meeting that? And you're going to do the same ask, suggest, recap, right?
Yeah. Right. So you go through the
You're going to
same
say,
process.
well, we could break it up. Okay, that's one way to do it. One other way we could do it is maybe this. Would that work for you? A lot of that, right? So you're going through that same ask, suggest, and so at the end, you know, you gain agreement on what the ideal solution. And if you do that collaboratively with them, what happens? It's their solution, not yours.
Yes. Yeah.
And they have a whole lot of
Yeah. Much better.
commitment to it and support for it than if you just
Mm-mm.
came back and said, surprise, look what I came up for you.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. That's wonderful, Greg. lots to think about there, and I know you go into some of that in detail in the book as well. So I'm going to put I'll definitely put the link to the book in the show notes. You also talked about pipeline in the book, and you've got a golden rule around pipeline. And tell me a little bit about your take on pipeline, because I think you have a very client-centered focus on pipeline as well. Tell me a little bit
Mhm.
in your words about what that means.
Yeah, so pipeline management, anyone who works for a company where they have a CRM system and a lot of deals on the go will do something called pipeline management. We describe a process actually where you look at your pipeline to decide what are the things that you absolutely need to do first, second, third,
Yeah.
fourth, rather than just the phone rings or an email comes in, I'm going to hop on that now. What are the
Mm.
high priority? What are the lower priorities? The starting point, though, is to figure out the golden rule, which is um, the selling process follows the buying decision process, never the other way around. So, what I mean by that is just because you were prospecting a client, and it doesn't mean that they're in the first stage, they're in the need recognition. They could be all ready to put out an RFP with a whole bunch of other people,
Yes,
right?
yes,
And or just because you put a proposal in doesn't mean that they've decided they're going to do anything. So it's really important that you understand where each person who's a key influencer in the decision
mm,
is in that process. And that defines what you do, right? A lot of companies have CRM systems that are based on what the sales rep's doing.
yes,
I made a prospecting call, then I do a discovery call. Then I provide some basic information. Then I develop a proposal, right? And then I close with a deal. Well, that's what the seller's doing, right? It doesn't take into context what the buyer's doing.
mm,
So because there's so much confusion around it, and confusion is not what you want when you've got a big sale on the at risk, is we have two tables. One that says if your buyer is thinking or doing these things, they're in this stage. They're doing these things, they're in this stage. So it
mm,
helps make it less subjective and more
yes,
quantitative.
yes,
And that helps sales leaders as well as sellers figure out where they are. The second table says, if they're in this stage, here's your key objectives, and here's the activities that you need to do, and here's things you should not do.
yes,
So it's, where are they? And based on what they are doing and saying and thinking, that tells me as a seller or a consultant or advisor what I should be doing.
I love that. It's much more, it's user-centric process rather than
Yeah.
process from my point of view. And look, that's probably the biggest insight for me too, because in my business, my pipeline reflects what I'm doing or what my
Mm-hmm.
team are doing, not what the potential buyer is doing. So that to
Right.
me was a bit of a light bulb moment, Greg. I really like that because in other ways I'm very user centric. I teach and I lecture on this and I think about this all the time, and I really am a proponent of user centric process development and improvement. But I hadn't thought about it in terms of
Yeah.
pipeline. It
Yeah.
just hadn't occurred to me, which is
I worked
crazy.
with I worked with an Australian company last year, and one of the first things I got them to do was change the labels on their CRM system
Mm,
to are they a prospect, which is no no established need, no feeling that
yeah.
we're right, no awareness of a need recognition. I now am aware of some problems or opportunities I want to take, but no commitment to do anything about it, right?
Yes.
Information search, evaluate alternatives, purchase decision, and then you can clearly see, well, what have they done? They've done that. Okay, they're clearly there. So
Yes.
a manager, sales leader, can ask, what have you seen? What do you know for sure? Actually, I'm not sure. Go back and ask. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
great for leaders to coach as well as for sellers to keep themselves on track.
Yeah, no, I really love that. I have to go and change our labels today. Thank you, Greg. So I just before we go, I wanted to also discuss, because I know you've had a lot of experience building sales teams, and I'm in the business of building teams, so I really wanted to have a bit of a chat about that. How do for you, what are the nuggets? What are the essential things you have to put in place to really build a great sales team? And I'm thinking of a context where perhaps you have a business that has decided to grow or are growing, and they need a sales team, and they're almost building a team from scratch in a way. So they've been doing it in-house, or the founders have been doing it, or other people have been doing the kind of sales role, but now they want to have a function that is sales. What would you recommend they do?
There are three things that you need to scale a sales team. The first thing, you need good selling processes, from prospecting to call management to managing an opportunity to managing your pipeline and therefore your time. So you need good sales processes. The second thing you need good sales management processes. There's 4 or 5 key ones. How are you going to do a one-on-one, a quarterly business review, a pipeline review, an opportunity review, a joint call, a team meeting, right? And the third thing is you need consistent execution of the first two, right? Or you can't do it.
Right.
And it's particularly important for entrepreneur, your small business. Gone are the days where I can go out and hire a couple, gunslingers, really top sales reps, give them a comp plan where they can make $1 million and tell them to go, right?
Love it.
Because the reality is that the really good salespeople, they don't want to work for you.
Yeah.
They want to work for the big fat companies with nice benefits and big promotional opportunities. So you got to have that in place. Well, the weakest link is certainly around sales processes, but the other thing is sales leaders, owners, taking a hands-off approach. They need to be actively engaged. They need to understand the sales processes. They need to inspect the sales processes. They need to coach to the sales processes, right? And so without that, you just can't. You're hiring one person, they don't work out. You're hiring somebody else, they don't work out.
I hear that a lot.
Right. And owners, who started the business, they can actually do pretty well with just because they're experts. They know their product, they're offering better than anyone else, and so they inspire confidence when they talk to potential customers. But a seller isn't going to have that, right? And so you need to give them solid processes where you don't need to have. You can still bring in the owner when you need that expertise, but you follow those 4 stages, and you can actually scale.
Yeah.
Common language, common processes, coaching, and inspection.
What's the main barrier to consistency? What have you found? Why isn't that simple? Why isn't that? So you've got your processes in place. You bring some people in. You teach them or you coach them. Why aren't they what is the problem?
I'm going to come up with a couple. One is, what we talked about earlier. A lot of people think selling is an art form.
Yeah.
You either got it or you don't. I just need to find a couple people with the art form, right, that really know how to do it.
Yeah.
The second is that, you go on Amazon, anywhere, Google, and look for books on selling. If you don't come up with 1 million, you're not trying very hard. If you don't come up with 10,000 sales methodologies, 1,000 people to coach and train you, you're not trying very hard, right? There's a ton of material out there. A lot of it was written by the fly by the seat of their pants kind of seller, right?
Yeah.
So people don't put in good processes or aren't comfortable with the processes they put in. I mean, you talked a little bit, your CRM. It's like you did that instinctively.
That's right.
Right. And B2B selling, I will tell you that what comes instinctively is generally wrong, right? What comes
Oh no.
what comes instinctively is business to consumer selling,
Yes, right. Because we are
right?
consumers. We're used to that, right? We do that every
Right,
day. Yeah,
right.
yeah.
And so if you don't find a process that's solid, if you don't implement it
Mm,
and religiously follow it, um, you get into trouble. And
yeah.
so it's a combination of having a misunderstanding of what B2B selling is, not putting the right process, not religiously um, sticking to it. I'll tell you, I've been involved in running training programs for some of the biggest companies in the world, like I said, Microsoft and Hewlett Packard, others. And I'm always surprised. I go in there, workshop, and the manager comes in and says, "Oh, this is Greg, and he's a really good guy, and you're going to learn lots." And then he goes, "Have a good day," and he walks out. Right? I'm thinking, how can you coach to this? How can you reinforce this? How can you
Yeah,
build DNA on this when you don't even know what Greg said?
yeah, exactly, exactly.
So
That would be very frustrating.
yeah, so
Mm,
a lot
hence
of
the book.
sales managers don't. I always like to say, first line sales manager is the biggest um, failure point in rolling out any kind of program, whether it's sales or any other program, right? And so, if first line sales managers don't understand it, adopt
Mm,
it,
yeah.
become experts at it, it isn't going to go anywhere. That's
Yeah,
one of the
you're
big
going to
issues.
cascade that exactly. And I because I imagine a lot of that, I'm sort of applying it to what I do with teams. A lot of that is actually also establishing a team of people who have consistency because
Hmm.
they're working on their group process continuously. They've got ways of working together. They've designed their work so that they can review what they do, they can continually support each other and coach each other, and they're reinforcing that process. And
Yeah,
that does start with the leader. That is the team leader's role to have an overview across those process transactions, if you like, and then building a relationship with ideally you have salespeople coaching each other and
yeah,
doing that course correction for each other. Yeah.
yeah. I think you hit all four of the ones I always tell people is a culture of learning,
Yeah,
leadership coaching, or even peer-to-peer coaching,
yeah,
a process, and consistency.
yeah, yeah.
Those are
Fabulous.
really the key ingredients.
Mm, yeah. And they're four things, not three things, but that's okay. Because we love the
You
three
caught me
things.
out. You caught me out.
We love the three things. So, Greg, you're in San Diego, and I'm in Australia, but a lot of people that listen are, across both nations. How do people contact you? What's the best way to? Obviously, I'll put the link to the book in the show notes, but how else can they contact you?
Sure. And actually, I sell a fair number of books in Australia, in the
Fantastic.
UK and
Yeah, of
Germany
course.
and Canada, as well as the US. So you can go to my website, which is p3selling.com, P number three,
Number
and
three.
selling.com. You can find me on LinkedIn. There's a P3 Selling business page, or you could connect to me at Greg Jerry G dash Nutter Nutter on LinkedIn. Or even send me an email, Greg at p3selling.com. All three
Great.
work.
All right, fantastic. And we'll put
Or
all
there
of
are
that in the
four.
show notes. Oh, that's right. Thank you so much, Greg. What a wonderful conversation. And we didn't really get to some of the other context for sales. So if you're up to it, we could always come back and do another conversation around that
Absolutely.
at a later date. It'd be lovely to talk to you again. Thank you
Yeah.
so much, Greg.
Appreciate the opportunity. Thanks.
Thank you.